I never thought it would happen to me. I was always the loyal one, the wife who never strayed, who prided herself on being faithful to her husband no matter what. I thought we had a perfect life, or at least as perfect as life could be. But life has a way of sneaking up on you when you least expect it, exposing the cracks you've tried so hard to ignore. It was a Thursday afternoon when it all began. I remember it so clearly because it was one of those moments where the world seemed to slow down, and everything I thought I knew suddenly felt like a lie. I was standing in the kitchen, cleaning up after lunch, when I got a text message. It was from him, Jake. Just seeing his name flash on my screen made my stomach twist in a way I hadn't felt in years. Jake was my husband David's best friend, someone I'd known for years. He'd always been around at barbecues, game nights, and even our wedding. We were all close, so close that I never thought twice about his lingering glances or the way he sometimes seemed to be a little too interested in what I had to say. But recently, things had changed. There was a tension between us, something unsaid, something dangerous. "Can we talk?" the message read. My heart raced, and my hands trembled as I typed a quick reply. "What's going on?" "I can't stop thinking about you." Those words, simple as they were, set my entire world spinning. I should have deleted the message right then. I should have blocked his number, called my husband, and told him everything. But I didn't. Instead, I stared at my phone, my pulse quickening, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. I don't know what came over me, but instead of pushing Jake away, I responded. "We shouldn't be talking like this." "I know," he replied almost immediately, "but we need to talk in person." I knew what he meant. I knew that if I met him, something would happen, something I wouldn't be able to take back. But there was a part of me, some dark, hidden part, that was curious, that wanted to feel something more, something different. My marriage with David had become routine, predictable, and sometimes I felt invisible. He loved me, I knew that, but the passion had faded, and I craved that spark again, the thrill of being wanted. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him the next day. It felt like I was walking into a trap, one I had willingly set for myself. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, far enough away that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. I arrived first, my heart hammering in my chest as I sat down at a secluded table in the corner. I told myself I was just going to talk to him, to tell him that this couldn't go any further, that I was married and this was wrong. But when Jake walked in, tall and confident, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch, I knew I was already too far gone. He sat down across from me, his knee brushing mine under the table, sending a shock through my body. We didn't speak at first, just stared at each other, the weight of what we were about to do hanging heavy in the air. "You shouldn't have come," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "I couldn't stay away," he replied, his voice low and filled with something I hadn't heard in a long time, desire. We talked, but it was just small talk, meaningless words that barely registered. All I could think about was how close he was, how his leg pressed against mine, how I could feel the heat radiating from his body. And then, without thinking, without even realizing what I was doing, I reached across the table and touched his hand. It was like a spark ignited between us. He looked at me, his eyes darkening with want, and I knew in that moment that we had crossed a line. There was no going back now. "I can't do this," I whispered, but even as I said the words, I didn't pull my hand away. "Yes, you can," Jake murmured, leaning closer. "You want this as much as I do." He was right, and that terrified me. I had never thought of myself as someone who would cheat, someone who would betray their husband. But here I was, sitting in a cafe with my husband's best friend, my pulse racing, my body aching for his touch. I don't know how it happened, but the next thing I knew, we were outside in the alley behind the cafe, hidden from view. Jake pushed me against the wall, his hands on my hips, his lips inches from mine. "This is wrong," I gasped, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "I know," he whispered, his lips brushing against my ear. "But it feels right." And then he kissed me. The kiss was electric, more intense than anything I had felt in years. It was like my body had come alive, every nerve ending sparking with desire. I knew I should stop, but I couldn't. His hands were on me, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, my mind screaming that this was wrong even as my body begged for more. It was quick, frantic, almost desperate. We didn't even make it past the alley, and when it was over, I felt a rush of guilt so powerful it nearly knocked me over. "What have we done?" I whispered, my voice trembling as I pulled away from him, my heart racing with a mix of fear and regret. Jake didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with an unreadable expression. "We can't take it back," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. I knew he was right. I had just cheated on my husband. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, and I felt sick to my stomach. I had become the person I never thought I would be, the unfaithful wife. But what scared me more than the guilt was the fact that a part of me didn't regret it. A part of me had wanted this, craved this. Jake had made me feel alive again in a way I hadn't felt in years. And that terrified me. "I need to go," I muttered, pulling away from him, my hands shaking as I gathered my things. "Please don't regret this," Jake said softly, his eyes searching mine. "I already do," I lied, my voice hollow as I turned and walked away. As I drove home, my mind raced with 1,000 different thoughts. What had I done? How could I face David after this? My hands shook on the steering wheel, and I felt like I was going to be sick. But even as the guilt consumed me, a part of me still thought about Jake, about the way he had made me feel. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. When I got home, David was in the living room, watching TV, completely oblivious to the storm that was raging inside me. He smiled when he saw me, and the guilt hit me like a wave. I forced a smile in return, trying to act normal, but inside I was falling apart. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice casual, like everything was perfectly fine. "Fine," I lied, my voice barely holding steady. "Just busy." I went through the motions that evening, pretending like everything was okay, but the truth was, my entire world had shifted. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I couldn't stop thinking about Jake, about what had happened between us. I knew it was wrong, but the memory of his touch, of his kiss, lingered in my mind, and I hated myself for wanting more. David had no idea. He trusted me completely, and that made the guilt even worse. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been awakened in me, something I couldn't ignore. And so, as I lay in bed that night, next to my husband, the man I had promised to love and honor, I found myself wondering when I would see Jake again. Because deep down, I knew I would. The days after my encounter with Jake blurred together, a haze of guilt and longing that consumed me. I had always been so good at hiding my emotions, at putting on a brave face, but this time, it was different. Every time I looked at David, my stomach twisted with shame, and yet, there was this constant pull toward Jake that I couldn't explain. I avoided Jake for a few days, telling myself I needed space to think, to sort through the mess I had created. But it was impossible. He was in my head constantly, invading my thoughts at the most inconvenient moments. I'd be at the grocery store, picking out apples, and suddenly I'd remember the way his hands felt on my skin. I'd be folding laundry, and my mind would drift to that kiss in the alley. I hated myself for it. I hated that I couldn't control these thoughts, that despite everything I had to lose, I still wanted him. David noticed the shift between us. Of course he did. How could he not? I wasn't the same. I was distant, distracted, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring myself to be fully present with him anymore. "You've been quiet lately," David said one night as we were sitting on the couch, watching TV. His voice was gentle, concerned, but I could hear the underlying tension. He wasn't used to this version of me, the one who wasn't glued to his side, who wasn't talking his ear off about work or friends or random things we needed to do around the house. "I'm just tired," I lied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Work has been stressful." He nodded, accepting my excuse without question. That was David, always trusting, always believing the best in me. If only he knew. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was lonely, maybe I was bored, Or maybe I was just a selfish coward who didn't want to deal with the consequences of my actions. But a week after that kiss, I found myself texting Jake again. It was nothing special at first, just a casual message about something meaningless, like the weather or some stupid inside joke we had shared months ago. But the conversation quickly shifted. It always did with him. "I can't stop thinking about you," Jake texted late one night. I stared at the message for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. I shouldn't respond. I should block him, delete his number, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself typing back, my fingers moving almost to their own accord. Me neither. It was the truth, as much as I hated to admit it. I couldn't stop thinking about him either, about what we had done, and what it meant. "Can I see you?" he asked, and my heart skipped a beat. I should have said no. I should have put an end to this madness before it spiraled out of control. But I didn't. Instead, I agreed to meet him again, just like the first time, telling myself it was only to talk, that nothing more would happen. But deep down, I knew better. I knew exactly what would happen. The second time I met Jake, it was at a hotel. That was his suggestion, not mine. I had tried to convince myself that it wasn't as bad if we were just meeting somewhere neutral, but the moment I stepped into that room, I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. It was different this time, not rushed like it had been in the alley. We had time, and that made it worse somehow. The anticipation, the build-up, it all made the eventual betrayal feel even more deliberate, more calculated. Jake was waiting for me when I arrived, standing near the window, looking out at the city below. He turned when he heard the door close behind me, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. There was no need for words. We both knew why we were there. He crossed the room in a few long strides, and before I could even think, his lips were on mine again, his hands pulling me close. It was like all the pent-up tension between us exploded in that moment, and I couldn't stop myself. I didn't want to stop. This time, it wasn't quick or desperate. It was slow, deliberate, and in the back of my mind, I knew this was the point of no return. There was no denying what this was anymore. It wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was an affair, plain and simple. Afterward, we lay there in silence, the weight of what we had done settling over us like a heavy blanket. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts, but none of them coherent. I felt hollow, like a part of me had been ripped away, and yet there was this twisted satisfaction deep inside me that I couldn't ignore. Jake reached over, running his fingers down my arm, and I shivered at his touch. "What now?" he asked, his voice low and tentative, as if he was afraid of the answer. "I don't know," I whispered. I really didn't. I had no idea what the future held, or how I was going to continue living this double life. All I knew was that I couldn't stop seeing him. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I felt like I was living two separate realities, one where I was the perfect wife, going through the motions of my everyday life with David, and another where I was tangled up in this secret, forbidden affair with Jake. The guilt was unbearable at times. I'd be sitting across from David at the dinner table, watching him laugh at something I had said, and the shame would wash over me in waves.
How could I do this to him?
How could I betray the man who loved me so completely, who trusted me so blindly? And yet, every time I tried to pull away from Jake, something would pull me back in. It was like I was addicted to the thrill, to the secrecy, to the way he made me feel. I couldn't explain it, but I craved it. I craved him. Jake, on the other hand, seemed perfectly fine with our arrangement. He didn't talk about David, didn't question my marriage or push me to leave him. He seemed content to just have me on the side, to keep things casual and uncomplicated. I hated him for that sometimes, for being able to separate his feelings so easily while I was drowning in mine. I thought about ending it more times than I could count. I would sit in the car after meeting him, staring at my phone, ready to call him and tell him that it was over, that I couldn't do this anymore. But I never made that call. I couldn't bring myself to walk away. It wasn't long before the cracks in my marriage started to show. David wasn't stupid. He could sense that something was wrong, that I wasn't as present as I used to be. He asked me about it one night, his voice filled with concern. "Is everything okay?" he asked as we lay in bed, the darkness of the room making his voice seem even more intimate, more serious. "You've seemed distant lately." My heart pounded in my chest, and for a brief moment, I considered telling him the truth. I considered confessing everything, coming clean about Jake and the affair, and facing the consequences. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't bear the thought of breaking his heart, of watching the love in his eyes turn to betrayal and anger. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just stressed with work, that's all." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe me, not entirely, but he didn't push. David never pushed. He trusted me, and that trust was what made everything so much worse. Things couldn't go on like this forever. I knew that. Something had to give, and it wasn't long before everything came crashing down.
It happened on a Saturday.
David and I were supposed to go to a friend's house for a barbecue, but I had told him I wasn't feeling well, that I needed to stay home and rest. In reality, I had plans to meet Jake, to spend the afternoon wrapped up in our twisted affair. But as fate would have it, David came home early. I hadn't expected him to, hadn't planned for the possibility that he might return before I was ready. And when he walked into the bedroom, finding me still in bed, my phone in hand with a message from Jake lighting up the screen, I knew it was over. "What's this?" David's voice was tight, confused, as he picked up my phone and stared at the screen. My heart stopped. There was no hiding it now. He had seen Jake's name, seen the text, and there was no explaining it away. "David, my voice cracked, the words catching in my throat. I didn't know what to say, how to even begin to explain what I had done. "Are you cheating on me?" His voice was barely a whisper, as if he couldn't believe the words he was saying, as if the possibility of it was too painful to comprehend. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The silence between us was deafening, and in that silence, the truth was laid bare. David's face crumpled, his eyes filling with a mix of hurt, betrayal, and disbelief. "How long?" he asked, his voice shaking. I couldn't lie to him anymore. "A few months." The look on his face shattered me. In that moment, I realized just how much I had hurt him, how deeply I had broken the man I loved. He didn't yell, didn't scream, or throw things like I had imagined he might. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me like I was a stranger, like he couldn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. "I trusted you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "How could you do this to me?" David didn't stay that night. He packed a bag and left, leaving me alone in the house that suddenly felt too big, too empty. The silence was suffocating, and I found myself sitting on the floor, my knees pulled up to my chest, crying like I hadn't cried in years. I had ruined everything. In one selfish, reckless decision, I had destroyed the life I had built with David, the man who had loved me unconditionally. And for what? For a fleeting thrill, for a momentary escape from the monotony of marriage? I texted Jake, telling him it was over, that I couldn't see him anymore. He didn't fight it, didn't beg me to change my mind. He simply replied with a curt, "I understand." And just like that, it was over. My affair with Jake had ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving nothing but wreckage in its wake. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. David didn't come home, and I didn't expect him to. I knew I had hurt him in a way that might never heal, and I had no right to ask for his forgiveness. But I wanted it. God, I wanted it so badly. I wanted to go back to the way things were before, to pretend that none of this had ever happened, that I hadn't betrayed the man I loved for something as shallow as excitement. David agreed to meet me for coffee a month after the truth came out. I had spent that entire month torturing myself with thoughts of him, wondering if there was any way to fix what I had broken. When I saw him, he looked thinner, more tired, like the weight of what had happened was still pressing down on him. I wanted to reach out and touch him, to hold him and tell him that I loved him, that I was sorry, but I knew it wasn't that simple. "I don't know if I can forgive you," David said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't know if I can trust you again." "I understand," I whispered, my throat tight with unshed tears. "But I love you, David. I never stopped loving you." He looked at me, his eyes filled with pain and confusion. If you loved me, why did you do it? I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't know why I had done it, not really. Maybe I had been selfish. Maybe I had been looking for something that wasn't there anymore. All I knew was that I had made the biggest mistake of my life, and I would give anything to take it back. David and I didn't get back together right away. It took months of hard conversations, of counseling and soul-searching, before we even considered the possibility of rebuilding what we had lost. But even then, I knew things would never be the same. The trust we had once shared was gone, shattered by my betrayal, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't put the pieces back together perfectly. Some days, it felt like we were making progress, like we were finding our way back to each other. But other days, the weight of what I had done hung over us like a cloud, reminding us both that things would never be as simple as they once were. I didn't know if we would make it in the end. Maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never stop trying. I owed David that much, at least. And as I sat there, staring out the window at the life I had nearly thrown away, I made a silent promise to myself. I would be better. I would be stronger. And I would never, ever make the same mistake again. Months turned into seasons, and David and I remained stuck in a kind of limbo. We were not officially separated, but we were no longer living like husband and wife. He stayed with friends for a while and only returned to the house when he had no other option. When he did, we barely spoke. The silence between us was thick and heavy, like a fog that never lifted. We lived in the same space, but it felt like we were worlds apart. Every day, I woke up with a pit in my stomach, wondering if today would be the day David finally left for good. The tension was unbearable. He would come home late from work and sit in the living room with the TV on, but he was never really watching. I could feel the weight of his thoughts even when he wasn't saying a word. And the worst part was, I couldn't even blame him. I knew this was my fault. I had broken us, shattered the foundation we had built over years of trust and love, and now I was watching it all crumble before my eyes. There were days when I wanted to scream, to tell him that I couldn't take the silence anymore. But what right did I have to ask for his words, for his forgiveness, when I had been the one to destroy everything? One night, after weeks of barely acknowledging each other's existence, David finally spoke. "I don't know how to be around you anymore," he said, his voice so quiet it almost got lost in the hum of the refrigerator. I turned to look at him, my heart aching at the sight of his weary face. He looked older, more tired than I had ever seen him. It was like the life had been drained from him, and I knew I was the one who had done that to him. "I don't know how to be around you either," I admitted, my voice cracking with the weight of the truth. "But I want to try." David didn't respond right away. He just stared at the floor, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if he were trying to hold himself together. "I don't know if I can," he finally said, and the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. "I don't expect you to forgive me, David. I don't expect you to forget what I did. But I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. If that's even possible." He looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time in what felt like months. His eyes were filled with so much pain, but also something else, uncertainty. Like he didn't know whether to hold on to the anger or to try and find a way through the wreckage. "I don't know what to do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if we can fix this." Neither did I. But I knew I had to try, even if it meant spending the rest of my life trying to make up for the hurt I had caused. We decided to try counseling. It wasn't easy to convince David to go, but eventually he agreed. I knew he wasn't convinced it would help, but I also knew that it was our last chance to salvage whatever was left of our marriage. Our first session was awkward. We sat on opposite ends of the couch in the therapist's office, both of us fidgeting, neither of us knowing how to start. The therapist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice, tried to break the ice. "Why don't we start with why you're here?" she suggested, looking between us. David didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the floor, his jaw tight. I could feel the tension radiating off him, and I knew he didn't want to be there. But he had agreed to come, and that was something. I cheated on him. I finally said, my voice barely audible. That's why we're here. The therapist nodded, not looking surprised. And how do you feel about that? I let out a bitter laugh. I feel terrible. I feel like I destroyed the best thing I ever had. David flinched at my words, and I instantly regretted saying them. I had meant to make it sound like I was the victim, like I was the one suffering the most. But the truth was, we were both hurting. And I didn't know how to fix it. I don't know if I can forgive her, David said, his voice cold. I don't know if I even want to try. His words cut through me like a knife, but I didn't argue. How could I? He had every right to feel that way. I had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and now I had to live with the consequences. The therapist nodded, her expression sympathetic. Forgiveness is a process, she said gently. It's not something that happens overnight, and it's not something you can force. But it is possible if both of you are willing to work for it. David didn't respond. He just stared at the wall, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the couch so tightly his knuckles were white. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that I would do anything to make things right, but I knew it wasn't that simple. This wasn't something that could be fixed with an apology or a promise. It was going to take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. And even then, there were no guarantees. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Counseling was difficult, emotionally draining, but it was also the only thing keeping us together. Each session forced us to confront the pain, the anger, the resentment that had been simmering between us for months. It wasn't pretty. There were tears, arguments, and moments where I thought David would walk out and never come back. But he stayed, and that gave me hope. The hardest part was rebuilding the trust that I had shattered. David didn't trust me anymore, and I couldn't blame him. He questioned everything: where I was, who I was with, what I was doing. Even when I was at work, he would text me randomly, asking for proof that I was really where I said I was. At first, it hurt, the constant suspicion, the doubt in his eyes whenever I left the house. But I knew it was my fault. I had given him every reason to doubt me, and now I had to prove that I was worthy of his trust again. I gave him everything. Full access to my phone, my emails, my social media. I didn't hide anything from him, not anymore. I wanted him to know that I had nothing to hide, that I was committed to making things right. But even then, it wasn't enough. David still kept me at arm's length, still held on to his anger and hurt. And I couldn't blame him for that either. Despite all the progress we were trying to make, there was one thing that haunted us both: Jake. The mere mention of his name was like a bomb going off in the room. We couldn't talk about him without it turning into a fight. David refused to ask, but I knew he wondered. Was it just once? Was it ongoing? How deep had it gone? He didn't ask for the details, but I could see the questions in his eyes every time we sat in silence. One evening, after another grueling session of counseling, David finally broke his silence about Jake. Why him? He asked, his voice raw. Of all the people, why my best friend? The question had been hanging in the air for months, but hearing him finally ask it out loud made my chest tighten with guilt and shame. I had no good answer. I didn't even understand it myself. It wasn't like I had planned it. It just happened. I don't know, I whispered, my eyes brimming with tears.
It wasn't about him, David.
It wasn't even about you.
It was about me.
I was lost, and I made a horrible mistake. David clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists at his sides. You could have talked to me, he said through gritted teeth. You could have told me you were unhappy. I wasn't unhappy with you, I said, my voice trembling. I was unhappy with myself. But even as I said the words, I knew they sounded hollow. It didn't change what I had done. Nothing could. The truth was, Jake had been a convenient escape, a distraction from the monotony and the routine. I had sought out excitement, and I had found it in the most destructive way possible. And now I was paying the price. The more we talked about Jake, the harder it became for David to move forward. He didn't say it, but I could see it eating away at him. Every time he looked at me, I could tell he was imagining me with Jake, wondering how many times, how far it had gone. I had tried to spare him the details, but maybe that had only made it worse. It was tearing him apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. "I'm trying," he said one night, his voice breaking as he sat across from me at the dinner table. "I'm trying to forgive you. But every time I look at you, I see him. I see you with him." I reached out to touch his hand, but he pulled away, his face twisted with pain. "David, I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. I've told you everything. It's over." "But it's not over," he shot back, his voice laced with anger. "It's never going to be over. Not for me." His words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me. What if he was right? What if it would never be over? Never really behind us? Could we ever move past this? Or was it too late to fix what I had broken? As the months dragged on, it became clear that something had to change. We couldn't keep living like this, in this state of limbo, with the past constantly hanging over us like a shadow. We were both exhausted, emotionally drained from the constant push and pull of trying to make things work. One evening, after another long, painful silence at dinner, David looked at me with a kind of resignation in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "I think we need to take a break," he said quietly, his voice void of emotion. My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe we need time apart. To figure out if we can really do this. If we can survive this." I stared at him, the reality of what he was saying sinking in. A break. Time apart. I had known this might be coming, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel so much more real, so much more final. "Is that what you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. David sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know what I want anymore, but I know that I can't keep doing this. I need space." "We both do." I nodded, my throat tight with unshed tears. "Okay," I whispered. "If that's what you need." And just like that, it was decided. David packed a bag that night, and by morning, he was gone. Living without David was harder than I expected. For so long, even with the tension between us, he had been a constant presence in my life. Now, the house felt empty, hollow, like a shell of what it once was. The silence was deafening, and I found myself wandering through the rooms, wondering if this was what the rest of my life would feel like. I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the loneliness that seemed to seep into every corner of my life. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that I had ruined everything for good. David and I still talked, but it was distant, strained. We met once a week for counseling, but outside of that, our conversations were brief, functional. There was no warmth, no connection, just two people trying to navigate the wreckage of their lives. Months passed, and slowly, things began to shift. It wasn't a dramatic change, but little by little, David and I started to find our way back to each other. The counseling sessions helped, forcing us to confront our issues head-on, to talk about the things we had avoided for so long. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, David asked me to dinner. It was the first time we had done something together outside of therapy, and I could feel the tentative hope between us as we sat across from each other at the restaurant. "I miss you," he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in what felt like forever. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I smiled through the emotion. "I miss you too." It wasn't an admission of forgiveness, but it was a start. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like there was a chance for us, a chance to rebuild what we had lost. Rebuilding our marriage wasn't easy, and there were times when I thought we wouldn't make it. The trust between us was still fragile, and there were days when the weight of the past threatened to pull us under. But we kept trying. We went to counseling, we talked, we fought, and we cried. And slowly, painfully, we started to rebuild. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect again. But we were both committed to trying, to finding a way forward, even if that way was filled with scars and painful memories. A year after the affair came to light, David and I stood in the same place we had been before, two people in love, but now with the full understanding of how fragile love could be. We had been through the worst, and we had survived. We weren't the same people we had been before, and our marriage wasn't the same, but in a way, it was stronger, more real. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a future again. A future that we would have to work for every single day, but one that was worth fighting for. "I love you," David said one evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "I love you too," I whispered, leaning into him, feeling the warmth of his body next to mine. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what the future held, we would face it together. The first time David and I made love after the affair, it felt like the culmination of a long, painful journey. It wasn't rushed or filled with the wild passion we once had. Instead, it was slow, deliberate, almost tentative. There was still hesitation between us, a cautiousness that hadn't been there before. And yet, the intimacy of it, the vulnerability we shared, felt more profound than anything we had experienced before. I could tell that David was still holding back. There was a guardedness in his touch, a fear of letting go completely, as if the memory of my betrayal lingered just beneath the surface. I understood that. It would take time, maybe a lot of time, before he could fully trust me again. Afterward, we lay in silence, our bodies tangled together, the warmth of the moment lingering in the air. I wanted to tell him how much I loved him, how much I regretted everything that had happened, but the words felt insufficient. So, I simply rested my head on his chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, grateful for the fact that we had made it this far. Despite the progress we had made, there were still moments when the past would rear its ugly head. We had rebuilt much of what we had lost, but there were scars that wouldn't fade easily. One of those scars was Jake. David never asked about him directly, but I could tell that the thought of Jake still haunted him. I saw it in the way he would grow quiet whenever Jake's name came up in conversation with mutual friends, or the way his jaw would tighten if someone mentioned him in passing. It was as if Jake's presence still loomed over us, a constant reminder of my betrayal. We hadn't seen Jake since the affair came to light. He had distanced himself, perhaps out of guilt or shame, or maybe just to avoid the fallout. Either way, I was relieved that he had disappeared from our lives. I didn't want to face him, didn't want to be reminded of the mistake I had made. But I knew, eventually, we would have to confront it. That confrontation came sooner than expected. One evening, while David and I were having dinner, my phone buzzed with a message. I glanced down at the screen, and my heart stopped. It was Jake. "Can we talk?" the message read. I stared at the words, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to process what I was seeing. Why was he reaching out now, after all this time? What could he possibly have to say? David noticed the change in my expression immediately. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice cautious. I hesitated for a moment before answering, knowing that I couldn't hide the truth from him. "It's Jake." David's face darkened, his jaw clenching as he set his fork down. "What does he want?" "I don't know," I said softly. "He just wants to talk." For a long moment, David didn't say anything. He just stared at the table, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood, as if he was trying to keep himself from reacting. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. "Are you going to meet him?" he asked, his voice low and steady, but I could hear the tension beneath it. I shook my head.
"No."
"I don't want to see him. Not after everything that's happened." David exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just a little. "Good. Because I don't think I could handle that." I reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "David, I'm done with him. I haven't spoken to him since it all happened. I don't want anything to do with him." David nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He still wasn't sure if he could fully trust me, and I didn't blame him. The wounds were still too fresh, too raw. But I meant what I said. I was done with Jake. That part of my life was over. I deleted the message and blocked Jake's number, hoping that would be the end of it. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's shadow still loomed over us, threatening to unravel everything we had worked so hard to rebuild. For a few weeks, life went on as usual. David and I continued to work on our marriage, attending counseling, and making an effort to reconnect on a deeper level. We were slowly finding our way back to each other, one small step at a time. But then Jake showed up. It was a Saturday afternoon. David had gone out to run some errands, and I was home alone, folding laundry in the living room, when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated for a moment before opening it. When I saw Jake standing there, my heart dropped. He looked the same as he always had, tall, confident, with that easy smile that had once drawn me in.
But there was something different about him now.
A weariness in his eyes, a heaviness in the way he stood, as if the weight of what had happened had taken its toll on him too. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice barely hiding the shock. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I couldn't leave things the way they were." "There's nothing left to say, Jake," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest, trying to put some distance between us, both physically and emotionally. "It's over. You and I, oh, we're done." "I know that," he said quickly, stepping closer. "But I need to apologize. I never should have let things go as far as they did. I betrayed David. And I betrayed you too. I've been carrying that guilt for months, and I needed to tell you how sorry I am." I stared at him, my emotions a confusing swirl of anger, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite place. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him that his apology didn't matter, that it wouldn't change anything. But another part of me, the part that had once been drawn to him, wanted to listen, wanted to hear what he had to say. "Jake, this isn't going to fix anything," I said, my voice softening just a little. "What's done is done. We both made choices that we can't undo." "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair, frustration etched on his face. "But I can't live with this hanging over me. I need to make it right somehow." "You can't," I whispered, feeling the weight of those words settle over us like a thick blanket. "There's no fixing this." For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the reality of the situation pressing down on both of us. Finally, Jake sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I guess you're right," he said quietly.
I'm sorry."
"For everything." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "I'm sorry too." Jake gave me one last, long look before turning and walking away. As I watched him leave, I felt a strange sense of closure, like a chapter of my life had finally been put to rest. But at the same time, I knew that the damage had already been done, and no amount of apologies would change that. Later that evening, when David came home, I told him everything. I didn't want any more secrets between us, didn't want to hide anything from him. So I told him that Jake had shown up, that we had talked, and that he had apologized. David's reaction was quiet, almost eerily calm. He didn't explode in anger or accuse me of anything. He just sat there, staring at me, his face unreadable. "Why didn't you call me?" he asked after a long silence. "I didn't want to worry you," I said, feeling the guilt creep back into my chest. "It didn't mean anything, David. He just wanted to apologize. That's all." David nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "I believe you, but it doesn't make it easier." I swallowed hard, knowing that he was right. Trust was still a fragile thing between us, and even though I had been honest, the fact that Jake had shown up at all was enough to reopen old wounds. "Do you want me to leave?" I asked softly, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for his answer. David looked at me, his expression softening just a little.
"No."
"I don't want you to leave, but I need time." "I understand," I whispered, reaching out to take his hand. "I'll give you as much time as you need." For the rest of the night, we sat in silence, the distance between us palpable. I knew that it would take more than just time to heal the scars that the affair had left behind. But I also knew that I wasn't ready to give up, and as long as David was still willing to try, I would keep fighting for us. As the weeks turned into months, David and I continued to rebuild the fragile foundation of our marriage. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of what had happened threatened to pull us under, when the memories of the affair seemed to hang between us like a heavy fog. But we kept going, one step at a time. There were small moments of progress, shared laughs, quiet evenings spent together, the simple comfort of being in each other's presence. But there were also setbacks, nights when the tension between us grew too thick to ignore, when old wounds were reopened by something as simple as a misplaced word or a lingering glance. But through it all, David never gave up on me. He never walked away. One evening, after months of counseling and difficult conversations, David sat me down at the kitchen table, his expression serious but calm. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice steady. "About everything. About us." I held my breath, waiting for him to continue, my heart racing with anticipation. "I can't say that I've forgiven you completely," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "But I'm getting there.
Slowly.
And I want to keep trying. I want to keep building this life with you if you still want that too." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I nodded, my voice breaking as I spoke. "I do. More than anything." David reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "Then let's keep trying." Forgiveness didn't come all at once. It wasn't a single moment or a grand gesture. It was a slow, painstaking process, one that required both of us to confront our pain, our fears, and our mistakes. There were days when it felt impossible, when the hurt between us seemed too deep to ever heal. But there were also days when the love we had for each other shone through, reminding us why we had chosen to stay, why we had chosen to fight. As the months passed, the tension between us began to ease. The trust, though still fragile, started to rebuild little by little. David no longer questioned my every move, no longer looked at me with suspicion every time I left the house. We talked more, shared more, and slowly, the walls between us came down. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, David turned to me, a soft smile playing on his lips. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thought we'd make it this far." I smiled back at him, my heart swelling with emotion. "Me neither." "We're not the same people we were before," he continued, his voice thoughtful. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing." I nodded, understanding what he meant. The affair had changed us, had forced us to confront parts of ourselves we hadn't wanted to see. But it had also made us stronger, more honest, more aware of the work it took to keep a marriage alive. "I love you," I whispered, leaning into him, feeling the warmth of his body against mine. "I love you too," he replied, wrapping his arm around me and pulling me close. And in that moment, I knew that while our journey was far from over, we were finally moving forward, together. A year after the affair had nearly destroyed us, David and I found ourselves in a place we never thought we'd be again, a place of peace. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. The scars of the past would always be there, reminders of the mistakes we had made and the pain we had caused each other. But we had learned to live with those scars, to accept them as part of our story. We had learned to forgive, not just each other, but ourselves. It was a slow process, filled with ups and downs, but eventually, we had found our way back to each other. And in doing so, we had rediscovered the love that had brought us together in the first place. As we stood together, watching the sunset on yet another quiet evening, I realized something. The affair, as painful and destructive as it had also been a turning point for us. It had forced us to face the cracks in our relationship, to confront the things we had ignored for too long. And while I would never wish to relive the pain of those days, I also knew that we had come out the other side stronger, more resilient. We weren't perfect, but we were real. And that, I had come to understand, was what mattered most. David turned to me, his eyes filled with warmth, and I smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle over me. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, his hand gently brushing against mine. I nodded, my heart full.
"Yes,
"I am." And for the first time in a long time, I truly meant it. The future stretched out before us, uncertain and full of possibilities. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and fear. But there was also hope and love, and the promise of a life we were building together, one step at a time. David and I had been through the fire, and we had come out the other side changed. But we had come out together, and that was what mattered. We had learned to love each other again, not in the way we had before, but in a deeper, more meaningful way. A way that acknowledged our flaws, our mistakes, and our humanity. As we looked toward the future, I knew that it wouldn't always be easy. There would be more hard days, more moments of doubt. But I also knew that we were stronger now, more committed to each other and to the life we had built. And in the end, that was all that mattered. We were together. We were in love. And we were ready to face whatever the future held.